question, because a talking point, a rebuttal to some of my viewpoints that I've described around SSRIs in particular, is this belief that the more severe the depression, the better the response. So almost saying, yes, we're overprescribing SSRIs, but there is a population where this is much needed. And the severe depression is a biological medical condition that deserves a pharmaceutical response. And it's just clear that the data is very clear that for the most severe of depressions, antidepressants are more effective. But our talking point where we say there's only a 2-point difference on a Hamilton depression rating scale, that's when you put the average together. So I tried to investigate that, but I was unable to find any convincing evidence that a certain population responds better to an SSRI. Am I missing something? Have you seen it to be any different than I have?
No, you're not. And that's a really important point, because I think there is this perception that, okay, maybe antidepressants aren't very useful for most people and have been overprescribed. But of course, there is this group of people with severe depression who have a proper biological condition and respond to antidepressants. None of those things is true. There are people who get very severe depression. That's true, and can be very unwell, can become very withdrawn, can even have sort of psychotic delusions, can sometimes in extreme states stop eating and drinking. But there's no more evidence that they have any underlying biological abnormality than there is for the general, a more typical group of people with depression. All these studies of serotonin, for example, none of these studies of serotonin have distinguished people with different types of depression in that way. None of them have isolated a small group with very severe depression that shows up as having abnormal serotonin, whereas other people don't. And that's true for all the other areas of biological research. None of them have identified a subgroup of people who have a biological process underpinning their depression, as opposed to people who don't. And then the evidence that people with more severe depression respond better to antidepressants is also not there. If you take the vast majority of trials that have been done recently over the last few decades, that generally would probably generally exclude people with really severe depression. But these studies, some of the analyses suggest that there may be a slight gradient in that people who have more severe symptoms show a slightly larger difference between the drug and placebo than people who have less severe symptoms. But even the people who are showing the larger difference, it's still a very small difference, up to maybe about 4 points on the 52-point Hamilton rating scale, as opposed to 2 points if you look at the general average. And that's still almost certainly not clinically relevant, and still also almost certainly explained at least partly by amplified placebo effects. But the evidence on people who have the sort of severe, what is sometimes called melancholic depression or psychotic depression, who often admitted to hospital, the evidence that we have for those people actually suggests that antidepressants might be even less useful than they are in the randomized controlled trials of people with more standard everyday types of depression. So studies that were done back in the 60s with people who were in hospital with depression, for example, showed basically no effects of the antidepressants, the standard antidepressants at the time. Those were not SSRIs, by the way. They were the tricyclic antidepressants, but they're often said to be more effective than the SSRIs by people who put across this argument. But actually, they were not found to be useful. What was found to be useful in that group of people was ECT, and I think it's the case that ECT can temporarily override someone's underlying emotional state by basically inducing a state of temporary brain injury, which then gradually fades, the brain recovers, and people sink back into their depressive state. So I'm not saying that I'm not recommending ECT. I don't agree with ECT. I think there are other ways of supporting people who are severely depressed. You can have a nurse or an attendant helping, making sure that people get fluid, making sure that they're safe, that sort of thing, until they naturally recover, which people do. So I'm not recommending ECT, but I'm just using it as an example to show that in these trials, ECT did seem to show a temporary effect, whereas antidepressants didn't.